Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again with another video. In today's session, we're going to have three chapters. First chapter, we're going to talk about using a chainsaw grinding wheel to do your rakers. So we'll talk about that. The second part, we'll talk about setting the grinder up to do the rakers. And in the third chapter, we'll talk about what the alternative is to set up your rakers. So in the first part, we're going to talk about setting up the rakers using a grinding wheel and what we need to do to ensure that using this grinding wheel will be okay. First of all, you've got to make sure you get yourself a wheel at 6mm wide. There's dimensions of the grinding wheel there, 145 by 22.3 by 6mm wide, and as you can see, it's got roughly a 45-degree angle on that, right? So that's the first thing you need, is a grinding wheel like that. Now, you don't just go out and set up the grinder and start doing the rakers the same height. What you've got to be sure of is that the teeth are approximately all the same length to begin with. And that is not always the case for various reasons. If you're using a file, you may be filing one side of the chain more than the other because you may be stronger in one hand than in the other hand. Now, if you are going to set up the grinder, you've got to make sure that you've got a raker gauge like this, because you need to set the height, right? And the height is that you keep the raker 0.65 of a millimetre below the top of the tooth. So the variation will be highest point of the raker to the highest point of the tooth. That's your 0.65 of a millimetre between this point and that point. And that goes to the end of the life of that raker. So if you've got a brand new chain, it's important that you try and file all the teeth roughly the same. And this is why some people count the strokes. They might do 5 or 6 strokes on each tooth. Then they may examine the chain and they might do a second pass, and they might say, I'm going to do 2 strokes on every one. And then they'll do the same on the other side. They'll say, I use 8 strokes, so I'll do 8 strokes on there. So that's up to you whether you want to count strokes, but you've got to do something to try and keep the teeth the same length. Some people even go to the extreme that they use a caliper, like a digital caliper like this, just to check and try and keep them. Very time consuming trying to do it that way. Whichever way you do it, you have to keep them probably within at least, look, no more than a millimetre difference in length from the shortest to the longest. So you need a bit of a variation there, because even when you get a brand new chain out of the box, it's going to be within a 0.5 millimetre difference between the longest and the shortest tooth. That's the tolerance. They make these are all stamped out by the millions. So when they're all assembled, you do get variations. They're sharpened on a machine. It'd be a much more expensive machine than a standard grinder, but nonetheless, that machine has got tolerances, and you do get variation of up to 0.5 millimetre, and that's even on steel chain. Wouldn't matter if it's steel, Oregon, Carlton, or whatever it is, you're going to get that variation. That's unavoidable. So you can only try and do your best to try and keep them the same length. But the most important thing is that you are aware of that, right? So when you go to sharpen your chain and you have a visual inspection of it, try and find a tooth that's about the most average length and mark that. That will be your master cutter. Then you will set the raker depth on that after it's sharpened, right? So you'll sharpen that tooth, whether it's by file or by grinder. You'll put the raker gauge on it, this one here. You'll run the file over the top, and that is going to be where you are going to set that up on the grinder, and you're going to do each raker the same height. It's most important that you try and keep the teeth the same length. So as I said, practice makes perfect. Okay, so now we're going to switch to chapter 2, in which we use the chainsaw grinder. Okay, to set up this chainsaw grinder, you're going to have to change this wheel to this wheel here. And you're going to have the slope that way, right? So make sure that you've got the slope that way. So when we come in at about a 60-degree angle, we've got this facing downwards. So we still leave this set up at 60 degrees and we leave this set up at 0 degrees, okay? We put our chain in. Now the chain, we spoke earlier before that we mark this with a red texter after we've sharpened it, and we put the Raker gauge over the top and we run the file over, and that's setting the depth, right? So this was the average tooth that was roughly the average length. So that's the tooth that was sharpened. That was the tooth that had the Raker gauge tool over the top, and we ran the file over the top of it. So that's our master tooth. So once you've changed the wheel, just bring the grinding wheel down and adjust your backstop so that the grinding wheel sits on top of the Raker. Adjust your backstop so that that is just touching, right? So you don't want to grind that. That's going to be your master tooth. That's what we set up. Start the grinder, and it's okay if it barely touches and you see just the odd spark. That's fine. Now, because the grinding wheel is 6 millimeters wide, you've got plenty of room. Just make sure that you put this Raker roughly in the middle of the wheel, and then you can proceed to grind every Raker. Now, if your teeth are approximately the same length within, look, 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter, if you can get it that good, the chain will cut straight and all the Rakers will be set to the correct height. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now in the next chapter, what we're going to do is talk about using a progressive depth gauge where you don't even have to use a grinder to set the Raker. So we'll have a look at that. Okay, in this chapter, I'm going to talk about using Stihls progressive depth gauge like this one here. So first of all, let's talk about sharpening your chain. Whether you do it on file or whether you do it on grinder is irrelevant. Whether you count strokes, how you set your grinder up, what you've got to make sure of is that whichever way you do it, you've got to try and keep the teeth approximately the same length within 0.5 millimeter where possible. I know sometimes it can be difficult to achieve that. You don't have to go out and use a digital caliper, but you can use that just to have a check to make sure that you're on the right track. That's about the only reason that you'd ever use that, just to make sure. So you do your best, and as I say, a lot of people count strokes just to make sure that they're filing the same amount off the tooth. But I don't count strokes. Well, I do, but all right. If I'm using a file, I might just see how many strokes it took to roughly get that tooth sharp. And I try and let's just say it took 6 strokes. Well, then I try and sort of mutter under me breath, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, next one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Pretty much do it that way, and if I'm on target, they should be pretty much close to each other, right? But I don't worry about it that much, and if the tooth is slightly damaged, then I take off whether I've got to take 1 millimeter off it or whether I've got to take 2 millimeters off it. Doesn't matter, because if it's damaged, it's got to be filed back to the correct length so that it's again sharp. But I use this depth gauge here once the chain has been sharpened left and right, and I've tried to got the teeth within the same length approximately. What this gauge does, which is completely different than the other gauge, is that this sets the raker based on the length of the tooth. So it's progressive. It starts off at 0.65 of a millimetre on a brand new chain, but by the time you get to the end of the life, you'll be taking about 1.2 millimetres. So the differential, brand new, the differential between this point and this point will be 0.65, but by the time you file or grind this back to the end of the life, using this type of gauge, the depth will be about 1.2 millimetres. So it's totally different. This method is superior for setting the rakers compared to this, or compared to using the grinding wheel. Most people can't get the teeth that close that have to be using a caliper to do so. You can't use your eye, and that's why I don't bother about using calipers or using grinding wheels. Just use a progressive depth gauge. It sets the depth based on the tooth wear. It's variable. And by doing it that way, it means that every tooth has the raker set based on the length of the tooth. Most of my chains are approximately the same length, the tooth, from brand new to finish. I mean, I could show you one chain. I'll show you one chain where all the teeth are approximately the same length. It's come to the end of the life, but that's the way that I can sharpen. So if you are sharpening your chains to the correct amount of metal that you're removing off, they're going to end up all looking like this. All as I've got is little triangles. They're all the same, within a 0.5 millimetre. That tooth is broken off. That's what happens when they get a bit too small. Little triangles. So you can get them approximately to the same length. Where possible, I try and keep them all the same length, where possible. And what I mean by where possible is that I try and keep them the same length, and I'm mindful of that. So some people may not be mindful of that and don't concentrate on that fact, get off track, and the teeth are all over the place. So it's just something that you've got to be conscious of, that you need to keep the teeth, where possible, where practical, the same length. Use yourself one of these progressive depth gauges, you'll never look back. If you use this type of gauge here, your cutting efficiency will start to drop off from brand new to end of life. You'll be lucky by the time you get to end of life if you've got cutting efficiency of 60%. Using this type of gauge, you'll keep your cutting efficiency from when it was brand new to end of life. If you use the grinding wheel, it'll be a lot easier, but that depends on whether the teeth are approximately the same length. And if you're good enough to keep the teeth at the same length, you can get good results using the wheel, but you've got to be mindful of the tooth variation. It's just something you've got to keep. But if you're going to keep the rakers the same length using the grinding wheel, then you'll be using this method, using this constant depth gauge. You'll set to a certain depth and you're going to try and keep them the same length. What you can do, and I've done this before, I don't have I actually made an adjustable Raker gauge, right? It's adjustable, and I'll see if I can dig it out. Okay, so this is something that I made, and it sits on top of 4 teeth, I think it is. It's just a little bit, it's shorter than this, but it sits on, it could be 3 teeth. It sits on 3 teeth. And I can adjust the depth. I use a feeler gauge put the feeler gauge underneath, and I can set the depth. So let's just say that I spoke before that we start off at 0.65, and by the time we get to the end of the life, it's 1.2 millimeters. So if this tooth is half worn down in here, I've got that set at 1 millimeter, right? That's 1 millimeter. So I can use this, place this over the tooth, and I could set the raker depth at 1 millimeter, then I could grind them all using that wheel. This is just something that I've made that I could have variable raker depths based on experience. So just remember that. We'll go over that again. The standard height on a brand new chain is 0.65 of a millimeter from here to here. That's the height. By the time you get down to this witness mark, it's 1.2 millimeters differential in height using this type of gauge. Using the adjustable gauge, if we start at 0.65 of a millimeter here, roughly about in that position there, about halfway down, I can adjust that to 1 millimeter. Place that over the top, and I know that my raker height has a differential of 1 millimeter. Then I can use the grinding wheel and do them all the same. That's provided that the teeth are fairly uniform in length, and it's all right if there's the odd one that's 3/4 or a millimeter difference, but not too many. Half a millimeter is about the maximum that you want, because they come out of the box like that. So you don't have to be too pedantic and try and get it better than that. If you're within a half a millimeter in length, if you can make it better, fine, make it better. Some people may prefer to have a dial gauge caliper rather than a digital one. Either way, it's up to you. My personal preference, after I sharpen the chain, this is the type of gauge that I use to set the rakers. To me, this is the best option rather than using the grinding wheel. But the companies, Oregon, do sell the grinding wheels, because some people do the rakers by grinding wheel. And if you're really good at keeping the tooth roughly the same length, personally, I think you really do need an adjustable raker gauge tool. So this is an adjustable raker gauge tool. It works good for me. I made this one and it works fine. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.